my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of the resistance by Germany in her invasion of Poland,
War was declared on Sunday night and I had my tonsils out on Monday. I had a radio in my room and everybody used to come rushing into the room to find out what the latest news was and what was happening, and I'd be trying to tell them.
I always remember in the office at this firm of Chartered Accountants Day, war broke out. I think every man in the place walked out. There was a recruiting depot in Martin Place and everyone went out and joined up.
Thing to do, fight the good old Aussie country. Well, we all joined up, a whole team of us, a whole cricket team and ice hockey team, all joined up together, a lot of us. We marched down Martin Place and said, here we are, do you want us?
We thought it was a continuation of the First War. I think most of my contemporaries were looking at it, oh, well, look, we've got to go over and finish these Germans.
Couldn't get over there quick enough. Our great fear was the war was going to be over before we got there.
There was an air of excitement.
When we sailed out the Heads, a big lump came up into my throat, wondering whether we were ever going to come back again.
I worked in a bank and I was in the territorials, or the militia it was then called. My colonel rang me up and said would I come along and do some instructing, which I did, teaching the first AIF the fundamentals, and then they wouldn't permit me to travel overseas with them, so I quietly applied and joined the Air Force. I went AWL. Now, I had a very understanding colonel.
I joined the Navy in 1936 in Hobart. At that time, it was just following the Great Depression. There wasn't a lot of activity in Tasmania, and I suppose it was one way of escaping to the mainland. I specialised in gunnery. During the war, I was a gunnery petty officer on board HMAS Sydney.
Well, I'd always wanted to do nursing, and I was reaching the stage where I thought I would, and then the voluntary aid detachments were formed in 1937, and we all felt that war was inevitable.
When I was 16, war had been declared, and there was a service called the Women's Australian National Service, which was you go one night a week and weekends, and that was there to train the young women in signalling, air raid precautions, first aid, and we did drill. And it was a forerunner to the women's services.
Well, it was a job at the time. There was no work for young people. In 1938, that ship used to cart sugar out to Flat Top at Mackay, and then load the sugar into the bigger ships. And I was just the galley boy.
I was studying in the university in America. Well, I was doing hybridising, pollinising, plant breeding, town planning. The University of Sacramento, it's a big agricultural college, but the war stopped that, so I joined the Air Force.
I was orphaned at a fairly early age, so that, and I got in without anybody signing my enlistment papers. Signed them myself.
Well, when you're 18, of course, it is a lot of fun, I guess. And I knew about the First World War, but I knew that this one was going to be a bit different.
Our first assignment, I suppose, was to the Middle East, where we trained in Palestine, then went over to Egypt, did some big training there. When I say big training, they trained as a whole division instead of just one unit. All soldiers feel when they're in their first action, they wonder whether they're going to be able to perform. I wonder, are we going to live up to the name of the first AIF? Because this was the first time Australians had been into action since 1918. The fear of failing, I suppose, was greater than the fear of anything else.
went to school then for 6 months to brush up on the maths. Marched us up from Woolloomooloo to the railway, into a train down to Somers in Victoria, digging trenches for 6 months. And then more study. And then we went to flying school at Benalla and then Wagga, Wings, Commission.
All Australians were trained under the Empire Air Training Scheme in Australia, New Zealand, Canada and England. I had a month in Sydney when I joined up, square bashing and all the rest of the elementary drilling and so on. And then they shot us over to Canada. It was marvellous. Marvellous. 18-year-old going to Canada, you know, and I thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I still think it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me because it broadened my horizons and I enjoyed my training. The RAF system, which I believe was amazingly good, let you decide for yourself who you're going to fly with. Didn't say brown, green, black, white, you're in the one crew, off you go. You met other fellas and you teamed up. We left OTU as a crew of 7 people. And we were like blood brothers. Went to Halifax and then by ship across to England, and that's when I suddenly realised that there was a war on, when the ships were attacked practically every night by U-boats, and we spent every night at our boat station. It was the first time we really knew what war was all about, you know, on a convoy going across the Atlantic, and Queen Mary steamed on and left part of the convoy because she could go faster than the U-boats, and it was full of troops. It was quite a shock to see an actual country at war, the bomb damage in London and all the rest of it.
We were, strangely enough, having a noggin at the local inn when a landmine was dropped alongside us, which was on the waterfront, and the cliff stopped most of the blast, but it blew all the windows in, and as the tumult died down, I found that I was the only one still standing up. Everybody had knew about this sort of thing and had dived for the floor. I hadn't understood that, but I learned fairly quickly.
The War Cabinet weren't very keen about having the women in the services initially, but when they found that the women were really fulfilling the role, they decided they had to bring them under the umbrella of the Defence Forces. Although the WAF were the first to be formed in 1941, they were referred to as an auxiliary, but later, to bring them into line, like the Australian Women's Army Service and the RANs, we were all enlisted. Some of the ladies in the Army were on guard duty with rifles. They were issued with a gun. We had the girls on searchlights, and they were up in Newcastle, particularly when the Japanese came into Sydney Harbour. So they played a lot of roles, the women during World War II in the Army. You could appreciate living at home, you're just there with your brothers and sisters and you're part of a family. But when you get into the barracks system, it's altogether different. Oh, my father and mother were quite happy that I was doing my bit, but when I said that I'd join the Army, they wondered, oh, I hope you're going to come and sleep at home. Because I didn't know whether I'd be home or not, but I said, oh, it'll be all right. But as it happened, after I'd done my rookie course, as we call it, we had a rookie course at Kalara, then we got our postings, and I was posted to the showground, which meant that I could go home and sleep every night. But a lot of my friends, some of them were posted, you know, in all the country areas.
My father was in the Army, and I knew my father would not let me join the Land Army, so I signed my own papers, much to my father's horror, and I signed my girlfriend's papers because her father was a darling but very slow, and the war would have been over by the time he signed it. And off we went. But my father had come home and said, you don't know what you're going into, my girl, and you will last 5 minutes. If he hadn't have said that, I would have lasted 4 minutes. None of us knew just what was involved with being in the Land Army. I always thought of it as chickens and lambs and all these niceties. I never dreamt you worked as hard on the land. The first day I used a horse-drawn plough, I thought the horse did all the work. I didn't know I had to steer the horse, hold the plough. I just thought he did it and I just walked along behind him. And the day I drove the tractor, I thought this would be fun till I bogged it. and had to dig it out, what's more. You know, when I milked a cow for the first time, I knew where the milk come from. And I thought, you just sit down here and the milk comes out when you pull it, and it didn't happen. And when I got down on my knees to see where it was supposed to come from, the cow let me have it.
And then training, the World War I sisters were there, training us within an inch of our lives. And if they could do it, we were going to do it.
We trained in our own time at our own cost, I might tell you. But we were trained, and I only had 3 weeks' notice that I was called up.
Well, the minute you finished your training, which was 4 years in those days, you put your name down with the Army, the Navy and the Air Force to see which one would call you up first.
The sisters had already, they'd gone with the first boys that left. In 1941, they naturally looked to the voluntary aides who were trained. They decided they'd send 800 to the Middle East. There was a quota from each state, and we were all wanting to be in it, of course. All our friends had gone. You see, we were of the age where our young friends were all enlisting, and some of the boys weren't coming back by that time. We went over on the Queen Mary. We knew it had to go somewhere because it was full of troops, 5,000 of them. My parents were terrified that I might go to the Near East. I think they were very relieved when they got the first letter to say we'd gone to the Middle East. We were very well cared for, and we lived in tents, of course, and they were scattered. They were in groups of 3 in case of bombing. And the thing I disliked most was the slit trenches, because I didn't like the things that lived in there before we were expected to jump in if the alarm went.
We became part of the Mediterranean Eastern Fleet, based in Alexandria under the command of Admiral Cunningham. We knew we were going to close and fight with 2 Italian cruisers, 6-inch cruisers of superior gunnery in terms of armament and speed. We knew that. We had breakfast that morning. We had boiled steamed eggs for breakfast. Captain Collins said, send the crew to breakfast. That's what we had. And we closed up at our action stations at about 7 o'clock. And at 8:25 a.m, over the rim of the horizon with the sun behind us came Sydney and the destroyer Havoc. And we opened fire on the Giovanni del Bagniniere at about 18,000 yards, which is about 9 miles. And on our third salvo, we got a we hit the ship. That took the sting out of them. The Colleone started to make smoke, or lay a smoke screen, and they turned away. So we shifted target to the Colleone, and we started to get hit after hit. So much so that eventually, about an hour later, she was just a hulk in the Mediterranean. And Collins ordered the Hyperion and another British destroyer, I think it was the Hero, in to finish her off with torpedoes. We were shut up or closed up, locked up, as it were, at our action stations. Sydney was hit in the forward funnel. Didn't do any damage, just blew a hole in the top of the funnel. We didn't know till we came out afterwards and saw it. You know, they didn't tell us, keep on fighting. So Winston Churchill acknowledged the greatness of the victory. He said it came at a time when the British Empire stood at its lowest ebb. France had just capitulated. Britain was in danger of being invaded by the Germans, and it was a great morale booster to the fighting forces of the British Empire as it was then.
And we were taken over to Greece, where we failed miserably. We were saying, when are we going to turn around and face them? We want to have a go, you know. We were being told to withdraw. We're going back to previously prepared positions. Why? Because, we've been outflanked here and there just weren't enough of us. You know, the Germans had 27 divisions available, and we had the Australian division not complete and half a New Zealand division, which and a few British support units which just weren't able to hold the tide.
Once you got into the thick of it, once you get into the raids over the centre of Germany, like the big city we called Berlin or the Ruhr. There's 30,000 searchlights and 35,000 anti-aircraft guns surrounding about the fighters, so it was live or be killed, survival of the fittest. It really was.
Well, you're scared and you're tense. Let's look at it this way. If you got up in the morning and found your name was down for operations that night, you were tense all day, but you're looking forward to it. And if for some reason your crew was taken off the list, you'd be disappointed.
Aware of fighters, tremendous danger. Collisions at night time, big danger. And once they build the raids up to saturation point, 1,000 aircraft going through a target in 12 minutes, which they were aiming at to saturate the defences. Yep. And it's a lot of Lancasters and Sterlings and Halifaxes and Wimpies, plus the German fighters that are diving on you. And it's a pretty busy old hectic few minutes.
The bloke that wasn't scared wasn't there. We in Bomber Command, the RAAF alone, lost well over 4,000 men. The average fellow didn't finish a tour of ops. The course I trained on in Canada, and remember we were pretty late in the war, I'm only a young bloke, I'm only 71 now, but the course I trained on, there was less than 40% survived the war.
Relaxation was a fundamental of the sort of existence we had, and we became quite good at it. We had one occasion where we were racing a draft horse and a cow around the mess, and somebody poured some water over the linoleum, which became very slippery. The cow won.
I travelled all around England. I bought a little two-stroke motorbike, as a matter of fact, and I drove that motorbike from Land's End to John O'Groats. I thought there was something to do, which I could say I've done. And on the squadron, it was called the Kerosene Queen, because I had obtained the fuel for it by fair means or foul, and most of them were foul. In London, we had a marvellous setup. It was Kodak House, which is on the Strand, had marvellous amenities for us on leave. We could go there, there were functions, you were given passes to go to shows. As 18-year-olds, there were girls, and we were obviously all involved in that.
We were in the Middle East, and we were totally cut off from Australia, and that was a very great strain. It was very difficult to receive letters, and there was no way one could go and ring up or send a telegram. Oh, we were able to send telegrams, but we were only able to go down to the military post office and choose 3 numbers. 26 said, I hope you are well. 19 might say, I'm thinking of you, and 41 would say, I love you, and that was it. And then you could put your name at the bottom, and they sent them, but there was no personal connection. We occasionally got a letter, and we were, I think our families occasionally received one, but it was very difficult.
We wrote little, with fruit and things that was to go overseas, we wrote little messages in the cases of fruit to whoever got it from a land girl.
But we worked 14 hours one day and 12 and a half the next, and we didn't have any days off for a number of weeks. If in between fightings and things, if we had some time, we'd be given a day off. We could go to Jerusalem or go somewhere. We were able to go, if we had a break, we were able to whip down to the beach. We had a little old bus that used to take us down to the beach for a swim. We weren't able to throw out any dressings or anything like that. And so they all had to be washed. And guess who washed them?
All of a sudden they discovered that women were able to do things other than wash up.
I think everybody worked. I think the work that the women did, the land army and the women that stayed at home and kept their homes ready for when the men returned and looked after children who were growing up, and it must have been very strenuous for them, and I think I preferred to do what I was doing.
They had coupons for food, coupons for clothes, and there was a limit of a lot of provisions. You just couldn't go and buy what you wanted to buy because it was rationed. The civilians had to work under conditions like we had to observe the blackouts, and not everything was freely available because it was being used for the Defence Forces. You've got the civilians who worked in the munition factories. They did a wonderful job, and the civil construction workers, they all played their role.
My father was in New Guinea. I had a brother up there in the Air Force, my father in the Army, and we were never home all at once, right through the war.
They were sending children and people to the country areas out of the city, and, you know, we felt safe because we were part of the country people.
And I can always remember going in a troop train from Sydney to Brisbane before I boarded the ship to go to New Guinea. And you've got all these triple bunks in a train, and you didn't get any sheets or blankets, you just lay on the hessian, and the food wasn't so hot. So, you know, but I think we accepted it because we knew that we joined the job.
My brother came home safe and sound, which was wonderful. I was sent to work for an Italian, and I was very angry about this because my brother was in the Middle East. And I pretended I was sick and thought, well, I'm not going to work for this man. And he was a wonderful man. His name was Popolado. And he looked after the girls. We all had sandwiches, and he threw them away and got them a proper meal. And he came down, he sat under a tree with me, and he knew that what I was feeling. And he told me his son was in the Middle East, and his son was with my brother. And he came home safely too.
Late in the afternoon, about 100 miles off the Western Australian coast, HMAS Sydney came across the German armed merchant cruiser, the Cormoran. The Cormoran was flying the Dutch flag. Captain Burnett said, "Give me your secret call sign." The moment that Captain Ditmars in the Cormoran received that signal, he knew the game was up. He ran up to German ensign, decamouflaged ship, and opened fire rather short range, almost point-blank range on Sydney. The second or third sailboat from the Cormoran hit the bridge of Sydney and killed everyone, killed the captain and all the officers there. There was a torpedo fight, I understand, which hit Sydney up between A and B turrets. The crew of Cormoran said that Sydney was limping away at about 3 knots, that's about 5 miles an hour in the old terms, towards the horizon, and that later at night, about midnight, or thereabouts, there was a glow in the sky, indicative of the ship blowing up. We lost a lot of good friends on that ship.
Oh, we never thought that we were going to lose. We never had that. I don't think any of us ever had that feeling that we were ever going to lose. No matter how bad things got, we were chased out of Greece. The Germans were into Russia. Japan came into the war and tore down to close to Moresby. Things are tough, but we're never going to lose. We've just got to get up and do them, you know. Well, they started to bring us home from the Middle East. I had 3 days leave, and about 6 o'clock at night, there's a ring at the door. Went to the door, and it was a telegram boy. We used to have such things in those days. Sergeant Jenkins, and yes, telegram, which said, "Report to camp immediately on receipt of this telegram," after only 3 days leave. And I thought, this stinks. Wonder what it's all about. But I didn't go in that night. I went next morning. I noticed a captain standing by reading a paper, and I thought, well, there's someone in authority about. I said, "Sir, what's the score?" And he held up the Daily Telegraph, and it said, "Japs 30 miles from Moresby. Seasoned AIF troops being rushed up there to stem the tide." I can't remember the small print. And he said, "See those seasoned AIF troops? You're it." 2 days later, we're out at sea on the way to New Guinea.
They had blackouts and the air raid practice, and the sirens would go and everything was blacked out. And then all of a sudden, I think that's when I realised that really, you know, this is really going to happen. Something's going to happen in Australia. The bombing of Darwin, horrendous. That was the biggest shock of all times.
The place had been bombed and there was wreckage everywhere. But You know, each trip you'd go uptown and there'd be something else bombed.
They even got down to Townsville.
I come from North Queensland, and during the Coral Sea battle, we didn't know whether they were going to land in Queensland, and the government of the day was going to give the Japanese Queensland, and they were going. They were going to form the Brisbane line. Ask any North Queenslander about that. They confiscated all our push bikes, cars, dinghies. I come from Serena, and outside of Serena was the one big paddock was stacked with bikes and old cars, and they had 44-gallon drums of petrol all around to burn if the Japanese had landed. It was pretty close.
It was very scary, as a matter of fact. The Japanese were up there in New Guinea, and they were pretty close. And it wasn't until the the battles of the Kokoda Trail, that the tide turned.
I thought we were going to lose our country. We thought we'd go. That's fair dinkum.
The whole thing resembles someone grabbing a piece of paper lengthwise and scrunching it up and then letting it go. And you don't walk along south to north in New Guinea. You go either up or down. One-man war. To be a forward scout, it meant you were the first person to contact the enemy. And that contact might have been a bullet anywhere in you, or at least a shot fired at you, which warned the others that the drill was to immediately spread out and find the weak spots and make it an attack instead of a defence. And it was pretty lonely out in front. You'd be looking, and in the jungle you can't see much. I mean, a fellow could be behind two leaves and you couldn't see him. A rustle of a leaf could be a Jap, or a small animal hopping around, it could be an enemy. Not the best job in the world. The walking wounded, if you were able to walk at all, even with the aid of a crutch, you had to walk back from the dressing station. But of course the people who couldn't walk had to be carried back by the fuzzy wuzzies. They were the mountain villagers who were so considerate towards the wounded. They would be just like a nurse looking after them. And they would be getting down inclines like this and up inclines like that and across rocks and through mud up to your hocks, up to your hips rather. And that was what the Kokoda Trail consisted of.
Blessed be the name of the Lord. We cherish his memory here, we commend his spirit to God who gave it, and consign his body to the earth.
Oh, well, we were so decimated, I think I was 6 stone 7 when we finished.
The hospital ship was going up north, and usually the hospital ships come under the Geneva Convention because they got the Red Cross. Well, what did they do? The Japanese bombed it and sank it. And you've got these people floating out in the Pacific, and with only one nurse as a survivor, which was Sister Ellen Savage, and she had men on the raft with her and attended to them, and she was a very brave woman. And I think everybody suddenly realised, goodness me, this is really getting close to home, but what a terrible thing to happen.
Down here we had the risk of the submarines. There was more ships sunk off New South Wales coast than anywhere else in Australia. I've been in convoys where the ship was hit. The Port Ma was one, she went down. And then another time I was in the Corumba and we were heading north off Bundaberg, and the Kawara was sunk. Our escort picked the crowd up in the morning. They left him in the water overnight, picked him up in the morning. So fairly close.
The U-boats had pretty well a free run of the oceans. The British just hadn't got their act together, and but round about in the summer of 1943, it all came together. We had the new radar, we had new techniques. The Royal Navy suddenly realised how to sink submarines, and the Germans had to get through the Bay of Biscay to get to the ocean, to the Atlantic Ocean, to sink the ships. And it was like a bottleneck. They had to get through there, otherwise go right up around the North Sea, which is a bit hard for them. So, and Hitler suddenly realised that it was so important to win the Battle of the Atlantic, because if he could get Britain out of the war, he'd have won the war. In July, we struck 4 U-boats in one day, which I think was a bit of a record. We sank one of them. But then 6 weeks later, our luck ran out. That's when we were caught by 6 Junkers 88s. And we fought them for about 3/4 of an hour, and shot one of them down, but we were forced to ditch in the end, and we ended in the water. 2 of our 3 dinghies had been holed, so we all got together in one dinghy, and we're very fortunate due to the courage of a Canadian Catalina pilot. He found us during the night, and he stayed there homing some British ships onto us. And he would have been a sitting duck if the 88s had come back, but he was the one, so we were saved by the ships, fortunately.
I spent the best part of 5 years in Britain. We were operating from Scotland in Beaufighters when we were carrying rockets and 20mm cannons, and we were trying to prevent the flow of iron ore and other worthwhile bits and pieces from Norway to the war effort. We went to Russia, to Murmansk. 32 of us went, 25 of us got there, and we were to stop this fleet attacking the largest convoy that ever went to Russia with munitions and support for the Russian war effort. Northern Russia is a bleak, nondescript area with nothing to identify any place on the ground. And a lot of aeroplanes got a little bit off track. We were attacked by 2 Russian manned Hurricanes. Nobody had thought to tell them that we were coming, apparently. And we were forced down on a mud strip. There were a lot of people there to receive us, all clad in very heavy clothes. It was pretty cold, with rifles and fixed bayonets. And one of them prodded me very substantially with a bayonet and drew blood on the inside of my jacket. I was trying to explain to them that we were on their side, that I was saying English, Churchill, RAF, Australian, English, and my wireless operator, who was a Cockney, said, cut out this English business. Tell them you're a bloody Australian.
Message came through, and we hightailed it in and begged, borrowed, and we got a little keg of beer. I've got a photograph of it too. We were trying to find out how I opened the thing to celebrate in the Fairburn Mess at Canberra. And then we ended up out at the Cotter River and had a midnight swim, I'll remember, and a barbecue. And that was our celebration of the old VE Day.
I felt a bit empty, I must say, because it was a bit anti-climax. But 2 days after VE Day, the telephone went, and my brother on the other end of the phone said, "G'day." And that's the first I'd heard of him since he'd been shot down 6 weeks earlier in Norway on an operation which I, in fact, had planned. He'd been a prisoner in Fornebu jail, held there by the Germans, and he'd escaped when an Allied plane had come and landed on the aerodrome, and he dashed out and upset his guard and dived in and managed to escape and got back to London the day after VE Day.
But then again, we still had the war in the Pacific, and that was the one that I felt that I was closer to, being in New Guinea at the time. We were away for a year in New Guinea. we were able to release the men to go into the battlefront. We also had a female Japanese interpreter who amongst our group, and she played a very important role. So, you know, all in all, the women really proved themselves, and they proved that they could do a job, and they did it well.
Morotai is an island just this side of Borneo, and it was where the troops gathered to make the onslaught onto Borneo and Balikpapan, Tarakan, and when we arrived in the harbour, the troops were practising and getting ready and loading up for the onslaught. And it does give you a sick sort of a feeling when you see all these young men crowding onto the boats, you know, to go over there. But in no time at all, they were back, or some of them were back, because they used a different approach. The ships that took them in were Australia, the Canimbla and so on, took them over and then landed them, went out to sea, sort of changed over to a medical reception area, went in, took the first wave of wounded off, and they were all plastered and beautifully dressed by the time they arrived in the hospital. I can remember going on night duty one night and I had 60 all plastered from head to toe, you know. You were all in the one family. The boys that were in the beds were either your younger brothers or your contemporaries or even your older brothers. You're one big family. If anything happened to anyone in that bed, you took it as personally as if it was one of your family.
We had boys who couldn't cope because they'd lost legs or arms. One boy lost both hands, and you know, the things that moved us deeply and still do.
You went to your tent or your bed and you would lie down on that bed and howl your eyes out.
Once our fellows were taken prisoner, they expected to be treated a la Geneva Convention, you know, whereas the Japanese didn't believe in prisoners being taken anyway. If you take prisoners, you've got to have people look after them. You know, you can understand that a different culture would look on it as, why take prisoners? Or at that time they felt that to be taken prisoner, they became a non-person. They wouldn't be recognised back home. He didn't want to be taken prisoner, he wanted to be killed, which was the main reason for the Cowra breakout. They didn't want to break out and do damage, they wanted to be killed to get rid of the shame.
I've had a lot of friends who were prisoners of war, the Japanese, and they're scarred for life. I had a lot of friends who were prisoners of war, Germans, and they're as fit as I am today.
We stripped the aircraft and flew all the POWs out of Singapore, which, not all of them, but as many as we could each trip. We took a load of boys to Perth and a load to Melbourne, you know, and then back for service, then back again. You could pick one up in each hand, and poor devils, because they didn't get really good tucker, you know. A lot of them weren't fit to fly.
When the POWs, the ones who came home, it was joyous, but when they saw them it was very sad, because those men came back in a terrible condition and they had been through a terrible traumatic experience.
The news came through to battalion headquarters that the war had ended. There was to be a ceasefire at 1100 hours. Better go around and tell all my blokes, you know, it's all over. We've won. Anyway, there's one fellow called Harry Lane. He said, "Hey, boss, anyone tell them?"
I think the bells rang and the poor old radio scratched its way through the airwaves.
The war was at an end, killing had stopped. Wonderful.
It was tremendously mixed feelings. I don't think you could go through an experience like that and not be very mixed. A lot of your boys you'd grown up with, you know, weren't there. We went out that evening and joined the millions of crowds that were, you know, celebrating and singing and crying and all those mixed feelings.
I don't know who told us the war was over, but the girls down tools and of course were calling out to me to hurry up, the war was over. And I had to sort of unharness the horse from the plough and put him, before I could do anything, I couldn't just leave him standing there with the plough. By the time I'd got to the truck, we didn't ask could we go, we just went back into town. The girls had the truck decorated with wattle. It was all over it. We looked like a garden. It was moving.
It was over in one way, but it wasn't over for us by any means, because we had a very, very busy time because the troops came through us on the way home.
We were coming through the Suez Canal and just in the Indian Ocean on the 15th of August. And the next scene, everybody yelling out and things, and all the lights went on. Thought that was a bit premature by the captain, but he'd heard the war was over. He'd been given official information by radio, and we finished up the rest of the trip home through the Indian Ocean and to Australia, having parties, as you can imagine.
I think we adjusted very well, but then along the track we realised that our service played a very important role in our civilian life because it built our character, it gave us independence, and we became our own women. And we were able to come into the workforce, and I felt that we were becoming quite equal.
If we hadn't have won the war, if the war had gone against us, not only in Europe but in the Pacific, this country today would have been a greatly different country to what it is.
I think it changed everybody. I think it gave us a broadening and an experience that we could get in no other way. We made associations and friendships. We understood more of the world a little bit better, I think.